Hello. So this video is going to be a crash course on the history of knowledge. So what does that mean? Well, this is actually a lecture that I had originally given as part of a first-year composition course that I taught, where the course was themed around epistemology. So basically, epistemology is the philosophical study of how we know what we know. So some of the central questions of epistemology and the things that we're really focused on for that course are: what do we know? How do we know it? And how reliable is our knowledge? And how do we know how reliable that knowledge is? So one of the fundamental premises of epistemology as a discipline is that knowing is not simple and straightforward. Right? Knowing is not just, I have been told this or I've seen this or whatever it is, and therefore I know it. Knowing is actually much more complicated than this. And so that means there are different ways of knowing, different approaches to knowing. And so in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the different ways that different philosophical groups or individual philosophers have conceptualized knowing over the course of history. So let me go ahead and share this screen with you. And let me pull up. All right. So this is the crash course on the history of knowledge. So there's two things I do want to mention right from the beginning here. So one is that this is largely focused on Western philosophy. Partially that is because this is a lecture that was given in a Western university, at Penn State University in the United States. So that means that this largely focuses on knowledge from the ancient Greeks up through the present, primarily focusing on European and then American philosophers. That means that this presentation in particular ignores, the most part, the really rich philosophical and epistemological traditions from East Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, indigenous Americans from both North and South America, and elsewhere in the world. Because this is a Western philosophical history, that also means that the majority of the philosophers discussed are male. And that has more to do with the way in which philosophical history is remembered and conceptualized than anything else. There have been incredibly important female philosophers throughout history. We know of some of them, but by and large, women's philosophical contributions have not been remembered in the way that men's have. The other thing I do want to sort of preliminarily mention is that generally for these different philosophical schools or movements or approaches, I've chosen a philosopher, just one philosopher who sort of represents that particular group. That is a vast oversimplification. These philosophical schools or movements or ideas are internally complex and often have very, very substantial disagreements within their own ranks. And I don't necessarily want to sort of brush over that. But again, this is a sort of crash course for a first-year composition class. So it does what it does on that level in order to sort of meet that requirement. So The first thing that I think you want to think about if you're trying to get your head around epistemology and starting into epistemology as such is to think about what philosophy is. And so I asked my students, what do you picture when you picture a philosopher? What does this term mean? And so people typically mention like the ancient Greeks. They mention people who question things, people who think about things, people who try to solve problems, etc., etc. And then I asked them if anyone knows the etymology of the word philosophy. So where does this term actually come from? What are the roots of it? And typically people don't know, but this is one instance in which the word itself tells you what the discipline is about. So the origin of the term philosophy comes from the Greek philosophia. Philos meaning love, and sophia referring to wisdom. So philosophy is literally the love of wisdom. And I think that's an important element in understanding what philosophy is about, because in this sense, philosophy differs from a lot of other disciplines, right? Like if you go into an engineering course, you want to learn how to design a bridge, it is crucial that that bridge actually stand up, right? You need to understand how to do something in the real world. Philosophy is not like this. Philosophy is not fundamentally interested in the question of what you can do in the world. It's interested in questions like, how do we generate meaning? What is truth? These kinds of things. So it's about knowing stuff, having info in your noggin, as opposed to about being able to do something practical in the world. So that's something that's really important to keep in mind as we start going through these different philosophical traditions and conceptualizing their role in epistemological history. So we would start the Western philosophical tradition with a group called the Pre-Socratics. We call them the Pre-Socratics today. They didn't call themselves the Pre-Socratics. A, because they didn't necessarily identify themselves as part of a group. And B, the term pre-Socratic means before Socrates, and they didn't know that they were before Socrates. So that wasn't a meaningful distinction for them. But what the Pre-Socratics did, this was a group of thinkers in ancient Greece. And essentially what they sort of came up with is this idea that the world is knowable, right? We can understand the world in systematic ways if we think about it carefully, if we observe the world, if we analyze data, we can come to some kind of truth. And the Pre-Socratics were an interesting bunch. And this is one of the places where we start to see that sort of broad divergence of opinions within a particular group. If we think about, for instance, the Pre-Socratics were fascinated by the question of what the universe consists of. And many of them believed that there was one substance that made up the universe in different forms. But they disagreed about what that substance was. So some people said, for instance, that everything in the universe is made up of different forms of water, or different forms of fire, or different forms of air. And they had big debates about this. And part of the problem that they ran into was that they didn't really have a way of testing any of these propositions. And so this is one of the places in which, for early thinkers, what we would today call science and what we would today call philosophy, as well as what we would today call religion, were all merged into one. So this is an important element in terms of what it means to know something, is that some of the disciplinary boundaries that we have today between science, between philosophy, between religion, etc., did not always exist. So this is the sort of starting point of Western philosophy, this idea that we can know the world if we analyze it, if we think carefully about it, if we observe phenomena, etc., etc. But then you get a guy named Socrates who comes along, and he starts coming up with what we call the Socratic method, which is basically involves challenging, questioning, probing, interrogating ideas, particularly abstract ideas, to try and get to the truth. So if you read the Socratic dialogues written by his disciple Plato, and this is a much, much later Renaissance era painting of Socrates and Plato, what you see Socrates consistently doing is saying, you have said you think you know what honor is, or you think you know what love is. Tell me what you think it means. Why are you wrong? That basically is what it is. Socrates is kind of a dick in a lot of the Socratic dialogues, because basically he just nitpicks and he challenges and he forces people to question the things that they think are right. And again, this becomes the Socratic method. And actually, this is still really important today. As a teacher, I use the Socratic method all the time. So when I ask my students, for instance, do any of you know what the origin of the word philosophy is? In theory, that's the Socratic method. That's not the best example, because basically the Socratic method is about trying to get the person being asked the questions to sort of come to the truth on their own through their own rational, critical thought process. But that's basically the idea. So Socrates, again, comes up with this idea that we can understand these abstract concepts, truth, justice, honor, love, things like this, by questioning and challenging and probing until we can't question or challenge or probe any further. And so that becomes the sort of foundational methodology for philosophy through to today in the Western tradition. Whereas Socrates was much more interested in these sort of broad concepts, a guy named Diogenes, or Diogenes the Cynic, comes along. And he's a really fascinating guy. Diogenes is one of my favorite philosophers. And he and the Cynics start saying, okay, we can question these abstract ideas, but let's also question stuff about society and the way that society tells us to live. So, sorry, I didn't want to click that yet. So Diogenes, for instance, this is again a much, much, much later painting of Diogenes, but he lived in a barrel in the public marketplace because he was like, yeah, society says I should get a house, but why? I've got a free barrel right here, and it serves just as well. He even famously challenged the Socratic philosophers, because I think it was either, I can't remember if it was Socrates or Plato who defined a man as a featherless biped, and so Diogenes plucked a chicken and basically like shook it in his face and said, "Behold, a man." And so again, it was this idea of, let's take this basic gesture of questioning and challenging and push it forward. And this gets picked up even more with a group called the Skeptics. And they were around in ancient Greece, but they I think became more central in the Roman era, in the Roman Empire. The Skeptics took it again another step further, because whereas Socrates had said, let's question these abstract concepts, and Diogenes said, let's question society, the Skeptics started to say, let's question whether we actually know things, right? What does it mean to know something? What are the limits of knowledge, the limits of things we can possibly learn? And so some of the Skeptics actually ended up concluding that we can't necessarily know anything, because everything that we think that we know always has a limit. And some of them argued, and this is an interconnected argument actually, that basically we should withhold judgment on any question until we have as much information as we can possibly get. Your parents may have told you, don't judge something before you know all the facts. The problem, as the skeptics were very well aware, is that you can never be sure you've got enough facts to judge correctly. And so again, this is why some of the skeptics argued that we can never actually know anything. Anything we think we know, that knowledge is untrustworthy. It is unreliable because there may be more information we don't have that would drastically change how we view the situation. So this becomes a big philosophical problem, right? How can we actually know something? And so one thing that philosophers try to do, and this especially becomes important as philosophy begins to diverge from science, early science, in sort of the Renaissance era. The Italian Renaissance starts around the 13th century. I think the Northern Renaissance in places like England, France, the Netherlands really begins late 1400s, early 1500s. But one of the things that happens is you start to get the development of a methodology for testing propositions, particularly propositions about the physical world, because people start to realize or start to believe that if you want to make a claim about the world, you need some structure for gathering data about it, and that should include a component of measurability. You need to be able to actually measure, test things. You need some kind of experimental design, and it needs to be repeatable. Other people need to be able to do that experiment and get the same results or similar results before we can conclude that something is true. And so one of the people who played a key role in developing this was Francis Bacon, who's an English philosopher and early scientist. And he helped develop what we now call the scientific method, which most of us probably learned in sort of middle school science classes and things like this. And it is all about establishing conditions in which you limit confounding variables, you assess a particular result, and then you draw conclusions. And so what he was doing was what we call inductive reasoning, which basically you have an observation of a specific incident and you establish a general rule about it. So I have done this physics experiment, right? I have tested this particular thing, and because of this result, I've determined that this is true of physics. This is inductive reasoning. This is one variation of inductive reasoning that's rooted in the scientific method. I've observed this outcome, therefore I draw this conclusion about the world. Inductive reasoning, incidentally, is the opposite of deductive reasoning, which begins from broad propositions and then applies them to a specific case to establish conclusions. So there's a line that I love from Star Trek, the original series, where Spock says something to the effect of, if I drop a hammer on a planet with positive gravity, I don't need to see it fall to know that it has indeed fallen. This is a great example of deductive reasoning. Gravity works a particular way, therefore, in this instance where I drop this hammer, the hammer will fall. I don't need to see it fall because I know that the rule applies. And so these are competing ways of thinking about things, but they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. We tend to use both inductive and deductive reasoning all the time. But we get this scientific methodology. However, this raises other sorts of questions. And so you get a new split during the Enlightenment era, which sort of begins, 1600s or so, late 1600s, mid 1600s, and really goes up through the 19th century, but the sort of high points of the Enlightenment are really late 1600s and the 1700s. One group that emerges in this sort of competing space is a group called the rationalists. And basically, the rationalists thought that the senses, the human faculties were untrustworthy, right? We can see something that's not there. We can hear something that's not there. Anybody who's ever been drunk, of course, has experienced this, where your senses do not give you an accurate picture of the world. But the rationalists were concerned about this on a much broader level, right? Like, what if I see this thing, but it's actually an elaborate illusion? What if my senses are fundamentally untrustworthy? And you got a guy named René Descartes. One of his ideas, what's sometimes called paper world theory, basically is that there might be a demon who is incredibly powerful and malicious, who has created the illusion of this world. Matrix, basically. And so I can't be sure that the things I'm seeing are real. And so what the rationalists thought instead of that, instead of observation, was we should be thinking about stuff. We should be rationally critiquing everything. And so one of the big important components, or one of the big goals for the rationalists, was what's called first principles. And the idea of first principles is basically to get down to a philosophical point where you can no longer question it. Like, you have to accept that this is true. And Descartes came up with his in a book called Discourse on Method. He wrote famously in Latin, cogito ergo sum. And this was such an important first principle for Descartes that even though the rest of the book is in French, he put this in Latin because Latin was the learned language of the day. So cogito ergo sum, most people would be familiar with this in translation. The English translation is typically, I think, therefore I am. Although it's probably more accurate, given Descartes' methodology, to say, I question, therefore I am. Because ultimately what Descartes sort of concludes is that I can't doubt that I exist. Even if it's not this physical form, there is something in the universe that is asking the question, do I exist? And so whatever that thing is me. That may be me, this physical body with meat and bone and sinew and fluids and whatnot. That may be a computer simulation. Descartes didn't know about computers, but you get what I'm saying. That may be a disembodied consciousness, whatever it is. There is something that is asking the question. I cannot doubt that there is a thing that asks the question. And from that, Descartes thought he could build a justification for accepting the world that we see through our senses, that we experience through our senses. Now, the competition for the rationalists was a group called the empiricists. And they basically take the opposite position. The empiricists argued that in order to know anything and experience it as true, it must be rooted in observation of phenomena. That just pure rational inquiry could never lead to genuine truth about the universe. Basically, they would sort of put it down to philosophical navel-gazing, right? Like, I can think about something, but I don't know that it's true. I could come up with a logically sound argument for why unicorns must exist, but that doesn't mean that unicorns exist, is sort of the empiricist position. So, one of the sort of most exemplary empiricists was a guy named David Hume, who was part of the Scottish Enlightenment. And he supposedly, though this may not be true, he supposedly argued that we should not assume that the sun will come up tomorrow until we actually see it come up, even if it has come up every day for the entire history of the planet Earth, past precedent does not guarantee future results. The only thing that we should trust is what we can actually experience. So this really takes a hammer to the idea of deductive reasoning, right? This idea that there's a broad principle, given the laws of physics as we understand them, the sun will continue to rise every day. Therefore, tomorrow, I know the sun will rise. The empiricists would say, no, throw that out. You can't trust it. You don't know that that will happen. The only thing that you can trust is inductive reasoning. The sun has risen today, therefore the sun rises. That's all you can do. Both of these things become important through lines in the history of philosophy, really from the 1600s on. And so they inform everything else we're going to talk about. But people continue thinking. They keep reconsidering. They keep reimagining what philosophy means. And so you get one of the groups that emerges really in the 19th century is a group called the pragmatists. And they start to see truth as conditional, right? Whereas a lot of philosophical movements prior to this have implicitly or explicitly assumed that truth is truth, that it simply is. It is tautological in that sense. A tautology in philosophy is a thing that is itself. It's a statement that reaffirms itself, right? What's true is true would be a tautological statement. There is no real room for argument there. The problem is that truth is not always so objective, necessarily. And the pragmatists really start coming up with this idea. So, for the pragmatists, the idea of truth gets linked to both the context in which that truth exists and the social utility of that truth. So again, this undermines the idea that truth is simply objective or ontological, that it exists in itself. Sorry. So Richard Rorty he's part of what's called the American pragmatist school, and he sort of challenges this idea that truth exists objectively, and instead asserts that how societies conceptualize things determines what truth appears to be, right? The truth is not objective, that the way that any of us encounter truth and understand truth depends on things like language, depends on things like social relations, depends on things like the functionality of a particular society, that all of these things shape how we understand truth to exist. Another group that sort of takes up this idea is the relativists. And the relativists, there's a broad range of relativism. So they're not really a school as such, so much as an underlying principle. Basically, they argue that truth is individualized to some degree. And there's a lot of disagreement about how individualized it actually is. But basically, they argue that individual and collective experiences and perceptions shape what we believe truth to be. So one of the strands of relativism is postmodernism. And we get a guy named Jean-Francois Lyotard. He kind of defines postmodernism. He's one of the first people to really define it, although other people come along and sort of say, actually, it's a different thing than what he says it is, or there's another portion of it that's crucial, or whatever it is. But basically, postmodernism, according to Lyotard, what he says is, simplifying to the extreme, I define postmodern as incredulity towards meta-narratives. So what he means by that is meta-narratives are these sort of overarching stories that help us understand the world. So religions tend to be meta-narratives. The fact that there is a sort of biblical history of the world, right, from the creation of the world through the destruction of the world, that makes it a meta-narrative, as well as its role in sort of telling us, here's how you should behave ethically, things like this. But you also think about things like Marxism, for instance, historical materialism or dialectic materialism. This tells us, here is how society functions, and it promises an all-encompassing explanation. Those are meta-narratives. They are stories or ways of looking at the world that give us an overarching explanation. And postmodernism, according to Lyotard, fundamentally challenges them. It says, yeah, but here's why that might not be right, or here's where from this perspective that might not be correct. And so, again, there is this sort of relativism. It questions the idea that we can understand things comprehensively and have those comprehensive explanations be correct. And this opens the door for a lot of different types of questions and challenges. And one of the groups that comes out of this sort of idea is a group called the constructivists, or constructivism. And they start looking at different ways in which social structures influence what's believed to be true. And so how do particular forces protect a social status quo? How do particular forces invoke change? Things like this. And how do each of these sort of groups, how do these different groups construct their own narratives and put them forward to make positive truth claims? So one of the people who's sort of central to constructivist thought is a guy named Michel Foucault. And he has this methodology called the archaeology of knowledge. And basically what Foucault did, and what he was really, really good at, is he would sort of dig down into the history of different sociocultural institutions. So, for instance, he's got a book called Discipline and Punish, which is about social observation and how we police ourselves according to social norms. He wrote histories of medicine in History of the Clinic. He wrote a famous 3-volume book called History of Sexuality that was supposed to have more volumes, but he died, unfortunately. What he did was he basically said, okay, we think of these things as just a normal part of the world, but they're actually constructed. They're built in particular ways to maintain different types of social institutions, social knowledge, and those limit the horizon of expectations that we have within a particular society. Institutions, society, sociocultural norms train us to look at the world in certain ways, and that limits what we can know. And so it's important to understand why these institutions exist in the way that they do. And so that becomes really important. Alongside this, you have the emergence of feminist philosophy, feminist epistemology. And one of the things that feminist epistemology does, that feminist philosophy does, is it challenges the tradition of, again, a primarily male-dominated philosophical tradition, and a male, because one of the things is that there are gendered ways of knowing, according to feminist philosophers, feminist epistemologists. Women know things in particular ways, and men know things in different ways. And part of this is again, this sort of constructivist relativist idea that what the social forces that shape us shape the ways in which we know the world. And so because women are shaped within patriarchal societies in different ways from how men are shaped within patriarchal societies, we can't start from the default assumption that male-produced knowledge is knowledge full stop, is knowledge across the board. That feminists assert that women produce different approaches to knowledge, and that undermines the gendered certainty of traditional philosophy. So one person who I think has done really interesting work on this is Donna Haraway. And she, in her book, Simians, Cyborgs, and Women, she points out that male biologists observed primates in the wild, heterosexual, patriarchal male biologists, observed primates in the wild, and because they were looking for confirmation of patriarchy, of monogamy, of heterosexuality, they found those things. But when later researchers who were not necessarily looking for confirmation of those things observed the same primates, they found very different behaviors. They found matriarchal societies. They found same-sex behavior. They found non-monogamous sexual relationships, things like this. The same thing becomes true when you think about things like medical testing, right? Like for a long time, when a new drug was being tested before being released on the market, it was tested on predominantly white men. And so one of the things that meant was that when women were given that drug, because their body chemistry on average is different from average male body chemistry, they would sometimes have negative reactions that were not predicted by the tests. The same thing actually was true for people of different races or ethnicities. Because there might be different elements to their biological history, they didn't necessarily react in the same way. But feminists started pointing this out, that when the male is the default within a heterosexual, patriarchal, cisgendered normative structure, that excludes other forms of knowledge. And one of those elements, or one of the branches of both feminism and a sort of early element of queer theory or LGBT studies, is what's called third wave feminism. And this particularly picks up on the idea that the self is performative. And this is the term used by Judith Butler, they're one of my absolute favorite philosophers. I actually got to meet them at the MLA conference earlier this year, 2024. I got to see them speak. Really, really great. But one of the things that third wave feminism, as well as LGBT and critical race scholars, along with many other philosophers nowadays, argue is that the ways in which we conceptualize ourself and understand ourself and how we behave and exist within the world are constructed within the limits of what society tells us we should be doing. My cat is screaming. I don't know if the mic is picking that up. But so Butler develops this idea of performativity, right? The idea that there's not a gendered core of the self. What there is sets of behaviors that society has coded either male or female. And if, like me, you identify as male or you are assigned male, then your behavior is policed in certain ways. If you engage in feminine behaviors, then society will attempt to correct that. often through things like mockery, things like shaming, things like this. And so people are taught to behave properly based on these social structures rather than sort of organic, self-generated behaviors. And so this impacts the way we know even ourselves, that even our self-knowledge is conditioned by the societies in which we live in and the norms imposed upon us. The same thing becomes this sort of same type of assumption that what society imposes upon us matters in terms of how we understand ourselves is central to decolonial knowledge or post-colonial knowledge. So one of the things that post-colonial philosophers or decolonial philosophers or anti-colonial philosophers tend to point out is that within colonized societies, particular ways of knowing, particularly European or Western ways of knowing typically, but not exclusively, those are imposed upon indigenous subjects or native peoples, often with the attempt to erase indigenous or native ways of knowing. So one person who talks about this is a guy named Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who's, again, one of my favorite philosophers. In his book, Decolonizing the Mind, he critiqued the British education system that had been imposed on particularly African colonies and Caribbean colonies, to a lesser extent India. India had a slightly different education system under the British system, and some other colonies did as well. But he critiqued this British colonial education system as attempting to alienate Africans from their own indigenous knowledges. So he actually went back to writing in Gikuyu, which is his native language, even though he did that much later after he got out of school. But the British school system had tried to basically criminalize speaking Gikuyu. And so he actually started as a philosopher and a fiction writer and a playwright by writing in English. And he later rejected that as a colonial form of knowledge. So Ngugi actually called the colonial education system a cultural bomb. And basically the idea was that it was meant to destroy the knowledge and the ways of looking at the world that he as an African person had. So ultimately, what's the upshot of all of this? This is, again, not a conclusive, not a comprehensive overview of philosophy. Oh, I think my cat is now puking. Yep. Gross. Anyway, sorry. But this sort of crash course does tell us a lot about the challenges involved in knowing something and the different ways in which that knowledge might be shaped, might be constrained, different techniques we could bring to coming to know something, etc., etc. All of which has major implications for us as thinkers, for us as learners, for people in the education system, etc., etc. Because we have to figure out, what does it mean to know something? What does it mean to learn something? How do we know something? And how do we assess whether or not what we know is true? So all of this matters. And when we start putting together arguments, when we start making claims and then trying to support them with evidence, with reasoning, etc., etc., one of the things that we as arguers, we as thinkers, we as scholars need to determine is what makes this truth claim trustworthy. Not necessarily true, because as we've seen, there are big problems with the idea of truth as such, but what makes this claim reliable? That has to drive the way that we're thinking about the arguments that we're making.